Let's talk about ICE's Firearm and Use of Force Directive. When I went online to read it, I found that the document itself is about 13 pages long. But I also found that all but about 1/3 of the first page, which was essentially about a paragraph, all but about that paragraph had been redacted. It's blacked out. You cannot read it. And on each blacked out page, it says B7E, B7E, B7E. Now, B7E likely refers to the Freedom of Information Act, aka FOIA, which allows public access to government records, like ICE's Firearm and Use of Force Directive. However, B7E of FOIA provides a basis for concealing information from the public. So I guess by blacking out the majority of the directive and writing in red B7E, 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 ICE is asserting that ICE does not have to make public its Firearms and Use of Force directive, and that it has authority to do so under B7E of FOIA. Now, the merits of that claim, whether or not B7E actually, provides a basis for ICE to withhold this information, that's a whole other issue. I'm not going to get into that. But what I will say is although I wasn't able to read the complete ICE policy, I was able to read the policy from the Department of Homeland Security. And this is relevant because if ICE is the child, then the Department of Homeland Security is the parent, and the child must follow the parent's rules. So ICE's directives, while we can't read them, we can infer that they have to be in line with the Department of Homeland Security's policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Department of Homeland Security, aka DHS's policy on use of force. I'm not going to talk about the whole policy, but there are just some points that I saw. So in DHS's department policy on the use of force, it does give a use of force standard. And it says that DHS law enforcement officers, which we know that ICE agents it says that they're able to use force which is objectively reasonable. Now, when they say objectively reasonable, what they mean is under the stress from the perspective of the officer in the moment when the force was applied, okay? So what they consider is that, sometimes officers have to make split-second decisions, and they're in circumstances which are tense, uncertain, rapidly changing, and it's from that perspective that they are saying that is what we'll consider when we'll consider whether or not force was reasonable. We're not going to look at hindsight 2020 and say, oh, we know now that it was a cell phone. No, they're going to say, nope, right in that moment, under the stress of the circumstances when the force was applied, from that vantage point, that's what will deter. That's what we mean by objectively reasonable. And so that's the standard right there. The policy also talks about, it gives like general principles, and it says like law enforcement officers are supposed to be guided by a respect for human life when they're discharging their duties. So that is supposed to be a consideration, a guide for ICE agents as they discharge their duties. It also says they're supposed to be trained in de-escalation tactics and techniques under the section which says use of safe tactics. So it says that, these law enforcement officers, they should use tactics which minimize the risk of unintentional harm and avoid serious property damage. Also says that law enforcement officers should avoid. So they should not unintentionally and unreasonably put themselves in situations where, deadly force is the only way out. There's a section called additional considerations. Under additional considerations, we're back to that whole, hey, they're able to use of force that is reasonable under the circumstances, right? But they say, hey, what this objectively reasonable standard does not require is it does not require these law enforcement officers to respond with the same force or less force than they're met with, okay? So what that says to me is, and this is my interpretation, is they don't have to fight fire with fire, right? So they absolutely can bring a gun to a knife fight. I think that's what they're saying right there. Also, it says that these law enforcement officers do not have to retreat to avoid the reasonable use of force. So someone may say, hey, he could have just walked away. It wasn't that big a deal. He didn't have to do that. Well, they don't have a duty to retreat. And they also don't have a duty to wait for an attack before they apply force to a perceived threat. Now, there's a section called warnings, and I understood it to say that, listen, when it's feasible, okay, when it makes sense under the circumstances, then law enforcement officers should try to identify themselves, give a warning, and give a person, they call it a subject, I'm going to call it a person, give a person an opportunity to voluntarily comply with the law enforcement officers, warning before they apply force. So that's what they should do. It also, I'm skimming through because I said it's not the entire policy. It also talks about medical care. Again, as soon as it is practicable, following the use of force, and once the situation is under control, then they have to get medical care for people who need it. Also, they have a duty to intervene in and report the improper use of force. So officers have a duty to intervene if they see another officer using improper force, and they have a duty to intervene and report it. There's also, I'm skipping. There's also a section on the use of deadly force. So with respect to, the use of deadly force, again, the force has to be, reasonable in light of the circumstances, right? And they can only use deadly force to basically combat a force that poses a risk of imminent death, or the risk of serious bodily injury to somebody, right? So that's a situation where they're saying if they're using deadly force, almost like there has to be deadly force coming their way, right? And they do talk about fleeing suspects. And it says, hey, listen, these law enforcement officers cannot just use deadly force to prevent someone from fleeing. But it also says that if the person that's fleeing, or the subject, right? I'm calling them person, but if the fleeing subject poses a significant risk of death or serious injury to others, then the law enforcement officers can use deadly force to prevent that person from fleeing. There's a section on discharging firearms. So essentially it says, look, discharging a firearm is deadly force. Discharging firearm equals deadly force. So you can only discharge a firearm in a situation that justifies the use of deadly force, because discharging a firearm is deadly force. So they also talk about, moving vehicles, vessels, aircrafts, and other conveyances. So I'm just going to talk about the moving vehicles. But my read of it was that law enforcement officers cannot discharge their firearms at the operator of a moving vehicle. So they can't shoot the drivers of cars. You can't shoot a driver. They're supposed to consider the danger that it poses, right? Because if you shoot a driver, the car is definitely going to go out of whack. Now bystanders are at risk. Other law enforcement officers are at risk. So the only way that they're not supposed to do that. The only way they can is if it's justified under the circumstances. Again, this is not a complete, run through of the policy, but because ICE's firearms and use of force policy was largely blacked out, just want to go ahead and take a second and look at DHS's department policy on the use of force, and that as a guide. So we know that ICE's policy has to go in line with this one. So ICE can have more restrictive terms, right? But they can't give more expansive authority than this particular policy does. Hope this helps.